Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Eli. We're here at Alluvium, and we're going to talk a little bit with one of the members of our community, Red Wilson, who is right here next to me. This is Red. And in case you don't know which one of us is Red, it's the person who just went like that. So now you can't tell. So Red is a musician uh, who performs here quite often as part of our Thursday reality open mic series. Um, she is also a very talented songwriter. And tell people what you're in school for also.
I am in school to learn.
What are you learning about in school?
Eli said I had to be serious because this is a serious thing. And I really love Alluvium. I love what's happening here and I love being a part of it. So I have to acquiesce and be somewhat serious. But it's very difficult to do. I'm in school, to answer your question. I'm in a master's program for clinical mental health counseling at Bushnell University, which is here in town, which is pretty cool.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I think a lot of your interpersonal skills have been really valuable to the community here while we've gotten up and running, myself included. And so we're really happy to have you here. So I would like you to give some general impressions about Alluvium and just tell people why you're great. You were telling me earlier that you're grateful for our community here. I'd like you to talk about why you're grateful, what Alluvium means to you, and what are some things that you want people to know about our space. And then you can ask me some questions, and then I have a specific topic that I want to get to about later that we kind of talked about earlier. But just tell people for now what you think of Alluvium, how you would summarize our belief systems, and what you're grateful for about the space.
That's all?
That's it.
To me, the space is I remember literally being here and having sort of the energy that gets generated at an open mic or a Sunday evening open mic kind of thing, and the sort of awe that I experience pretty often from being around people who are exchanging creative energy, sharing ourselves authentically with each other. It feels like the space of possibility. And part of that, I think, is because it does seem, and this I think ties in with the religious belief part, which is that it feels very much like a collaborative endeavor where there's like an openness to the complexity of
Openness to the complexity. That's a nice turn of phrase. Keep going.
An openness to the complexity of being a human, having needs such as community, food, thinking of the burrito brigade, creative expression, organizing, various kinds of, like, if you want to take it to sort of a Maslow hierarchy, it seems like this is like a river delta for many needs to get met. And that's what I appreciate about it. And not, which includes this discussion about spirituality, which is really nice.
How would you define our spiritual and religious belief system?
Silly. I would define it as, it seems to be mostly, bye.
Thanks very much. Nice to see you.
Yeah, great practicing with you.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry about the interruption. Go ahead.
It seems like the spirituality part is very much directed by you.
No, I'm curious to hear more. We don't want it to be that way, of course, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I think people are, the perception that I get is people show up here and they're kind of like, what is this? What's going on? There's a multitude of, like, variety. There's a variety of events, a variety of genres. Let's see what else. It's a church, so symbolically, it has this history where it was tied to like other religious groups and practices. Yeah, so I think it folds in with, again, the collaborative endeavor thing where people are showing up and being like, what is this place? And you're like, well, it's a place where you can explore the meaning of life.
Yeah, that's well said, and I mean, I like that. I think sometimes it's a little too broad, and people are a little surprised by that, and they don't really know what to do with that initially, right? Because I always say this is a place where we want people to achieve spiritual actualization.
Yeah.
And then people ask, well, what does that mean? I say, well, you define that for yourself. So in some ways, I'm really like, as a pastor, kind of phoning it in, right? Because I'm really not defining what I want people to achieve while they're here. But I do feel like that is a useful thing to say. It's very experimental, but I feel like so many religions will say, here are the dicta, here are the tenets of spirituality that you should follow. We do have tenets of our belief system, but we don't really tell people this is what you should believe. And I think sometimes people come in and they say, what are the belief systems of Alluvium? And sometimes I like to say, well, what are your beliefs? What do you want to bring to the table? And what kind of religious experience would you like to have, or spiritual experience? And then sometimes people have an answer, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they just want to ask more questions. And I think that's okay too. But a lot of what we have are specific beliefs. But a lot of it's very vague. And I'm actually kind of okay with that, even though I know that for some people who come in here, it's kind of jarring, and they're like, well, I don't really know what to do with that. Do you have any other thoughts on what our specific spiritual beliefs are? Like, how are we different than other religions, for instance?
The approach that you're taking when people come here, engaged in the process of asking questions, and for you to invite them to look inward and sort of answer their own questions in a way, that seems to be an approach that people aren't really used to. And when you say you have specific religious tenets, at the same time, it still seems like a choose your own adventure.
It really is. And I mean, like our tenets are written in I don't know if you've even read the full list. Oh, okay, yeah. So, and they're quite vague. Like, so we believe that, for instance, and by we, I think I'm speaking for both of us, or I hope I am.
Let's find out.
That science is an important part of religion, and that questions of cosmogony and eschatology, where the universe came from, where it is ultimately going, are, I think, questions that are maybe not completely, but partially answered by the sciences. And our goal is not to say, here's the narrative that explains this. It's really to say, okay, we have some information about some of the answers to some of these questions. And now let's reflect on that and say, what does that mean for us as philosophical and spiritual beings? How can we take that scientific information and add a dimension onto it of spirituality? I think that's, in some ways it's very vague, in some ways it's sort of specific, but I would hope that that is a prerequisite to the stance of involvement that people have when they come to our space. Any thoughts on that specifically?
Yeah, the idea that science is important strikes me as
incorrect.
Yeah, totally needs to get that out of here.
Yeah, done. It's scratched. Yeah.
I think science is really interesting because it is a cultural phenomenon, but at the same time, it seeks to be sort of acultural. It seeks to be like incredibly objective.
Sometimes it falls short in that goal.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily realize that it falls short in that goal. It doesn't understand itself as a cultural thing. So I'm wondering if you think that science being important, like, how does that translate into the practices that Alluvium has?
Okay, let me give an example. Okay, um, I don't believe in the Big Bang Theory. A lot of people are quite surprised by that, right? Because a lot of religions will say, the Big Bang Theory is bunk, God created the universe, and that's not what I believe. I believe that the Big Bang Theory explains a lot of the observations about the universe.
Mhm.
So when I say I believe that science is correct, that doesn't mean that necessarily I believe the Big Bang Theory is correct.
Mhm.
What I believe is that the evidence exists for the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory explains that evidence, but it doesn't explain it completely, and there's still holes missing.
Mhm.
But it's still interesting to think about. So I think the universe is very, very old, and that humans are, on a cosmological timescale, really infinitesimal in some regards. So that to me makes me think interesting things about the universe, right? And yet, on the other side of that, that could mean that humans are very insignificant in the universe. But there is another side to that, which is the Fermi paradox. And Enrico Fermi came up with this idea that the universe is very, very old. It doesn't take that long for an intelligent society to evolve and to colonize a galaxy. So therefore, the Milky Way should have been colonized. And there's sort of this paradox that if you look around the universe, there's no intelligent life that we see. It's just silence all around us. So that to me means that maybe humans are very infinitesimal, which we know by looking at the time scale of our existence and contrasting it with the cosmological time scale. But on the other hand, we can also say that our existences may be very precious because maybe we are the first protons, neutrons, and electrons in the history of the universe. The MRIs.
I saw a t-shirt yesterday.
Yeah. But maybe we are the first protons, neutrons, and electrons in the history of the universe that can look at themselves and say, we are protons, neutrons, and electrons. And maybe there is something very sacred and very precious. And it doesn't have to be magical. It can just be like sort of an awe-inspiring realization that for the first time, the universe has created a lens that can view itself in such elegant detail from the microscopic to the cosmological scale. It's just kind of so I think of that as like taking a scientific revelation and then imparting some philosophical and spiritual dimensionality to it. And I think that is what I want people to come away with when, yeah. So when I say I don't believe in the Big Bang Theory, there are a lot of holes that any scientist, I think, will admit that the Big Bang Theory has. For instance, the Big Bang Theory predicts a very messy universe, right? If you let off an explosion, it usually mathematically just results in a lot of like really dense chunks and a lot of empty space. And we know from looking at the universe that it's very, very homogeneous, strikingly so. So Alan Guth from MIT came up with this explanation for why that contrast exists, which is inflationary cosmology. And you're welcome to look up that theory. It's a very interesting theory, but there's a lot of hand waving in it. So when I say I don't believe in the Big Bang Theory, I think there are a lot of observations that are really well explained by the Big Bang Theory. But on the other hand, there are a lot of gaps in it. And inflationary cosmology is one example of a gap that we've kind of filled in with some mathematical hand waving, but it doesn't fully explain it. Here's another example. The Big Bang Theory predicts that there should have, at the outset of the universe, been an equal amount of matter and antimatter that should have been created and obliterated. We think what happened was that there was matter that had a slight surplus and antimatter that had a very, very slight deficit, and that surplus of matter then created everything else in existence. But we don't know how or why that happened, and we don't know why the universe created this surplus of matter, and we don't know that there are no pockets of antimatter theoretically that could exist. So when I say I believe in the science, I believe in the facts of the science, but I do agree with you that Western science does have a habit of filling in the gaps in the most sparse explanations possible. That's not always correct. that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an old man with a beard who waved a magic wand to create all this, but I think it's still interesting to think about. And I think the more you think about things like the Big Bang and things like what matter is in the universe and things like luminous matter and dark energy, the more you realize how special it is to be one of the tiny, infinitesimal, briefly existing fragments of matter that can look at itself and say, we are luminous matter. We are baryonic matter. I think those are interesting revelations, and I think they carry a lot of weight, and they're awe-inspiring. And I think the traditional debate between religion and science has been sort of, science says, well, we have these explanations, and they're very reductionistic, and they're very simplified. And although they are in some regards reductionistic, I think they're still very awe-inspiring, and they should make us think deeply and profoundly about how we live. And they should make us think, well, if we're the only chance that the universe has had to create a lens to view itself, then that's really magical. And we should really take that lens and really study the universe and really think about what is it that gave rise to us, and why did humans come into existence? Does the universe want to create lenses to see itself? Does it have some sort of innate property that creates, individuals to like view itself? So that's why I think science comes into play, and I think these are really interesting topics to think about. Question? Yes.
What do you think about someone like me who comes into the church, not super interested in having these kinds of conversations?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Partly because, not because, but, well, yeah, partly because I feel relatively satisfied with acknowledging that my comprehension is limited. And so from that place, I feel almost like settled. And I mostly like consult my internal compass and my sense of like connection with others. So what I'm trying to say is, how does someone like me fit into the church?
I think really well, because whereas I see the universe as a set of scientific revelations, which are super important, I think, you see the universe very differently than me. So I define spirituality, and I define like talking about that sort of stuff to be a very spiritually nourishing experience. But you define spiritually nourishing in an emotional landscape of which I see only a tiny fraction, honestly. And your emotional depth is super impressive. And your ability to intuit other people's emotions, again, very, very impressive. And so it's interesting for me because I think some of that emotional exchange, in part through your music and in part just your other interpersonal communications, is how you define spiritual nourishment. And the scientific, like thinking about all that stuff, is how I define it. And I think there's room for both. And I think that is the takeaway message.
And that's part of what makes it hard to define, because it is so open. And it's open, it's the paradox between the uniqueness of each individual and the similarities that we all have in common. And how do you talk about that in a podcast or with words?
Well, I think you have to acknowledge it at least, and I think that's the start. And one of the important ideas of Alluvium in our tenets of belief is that human experience is inherently fractionated, right? So fractionated. So I see only a fraction of what you see as spirituality. And what I see is a very, very narrow window. And so the way that I can transcend that inherent limitation in the fractionated viewpoint that I have of the universe is by talking to you and by what we're doing right now.
Like so, a dialectic.
Through a dialectical process, exactly, yeah. And go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
What were you going to say?
No, what were you going to say?
I majored in philosophy. And I think I was motivated by having experienced trauma early on. I think it really motivated me to ask deep questions about cosmogony and eschatology. I think it motivated me to get really serious about the, I was very aware of the finite amount of time and resources that I have in this human experience. So I wanted to understand it and like find my power in it, and ultimately live in alignment with my values. It's like I want to spend my life really well, knowing that it's precious and short. And so I think that motivated me to major in philosophy, to ask these questions. And then it wasn't until I think encountering NVC, nonviolent communication, by Marshall Rosenberg. I was living in Santa Cruz and he lived in Santa Cruz, so it was part of my culture, kind of. Nonviolent communication teaches a 4-part framework, and a part of that framework is, can I just kind of break it down?
Sure, sure.
So the 4-part framework, the first is observations. So learning to assess or take in what is actually happening without judgment, more or less. And then the second part is feelings or emotions that are arising in relation to what is happening. And then the third is values or needs that are being indicated by the emotions. Typically, emotions that feel uncomfortable mean a value is not being met, and emotions that feel positive mean a value is being met. So, and then the fourth part is strategies, or like ways to get our values met or more often. Anyway, the point is that before that framework, I didn't understand the role of emotions. And I now think that their role is like a signal, a system of signals and indicators about how to live our lives in alignment with our values. And I think that when you ponder these scientific inquiries and the history of the universe and try to understand the meaning, to me that feels like it's like a search for what are my values. Like, what does this mean for me? What does this history mean for how I want to live my life and like be in the world? And ultimately, that's what I see Alluvium as. It's like a space where we can come together, have these dialectical exchanges, work with energy, work with, whatever, I mean, that's my version, work with energy, like the yoga and the music and la, like move energy around as we explore what it means to be human and how we want to live.
That's a wonderful analysis, and I really like that. And I would agree with you that when I look at the universe, I feel like my values are not yet really fully defined. And in some ways, maybe that's okay. I like to remind people that there's like numbers in the universe that we found, like Graham's number, which is a number so massive that if you had it in your head, your head would turn into a black hole. And that's not an exaggeration. That's like literally there's so many digits in Graham's number that if you could even hold it in your head, your brain would turn into a black hole, just because the information density that the universe can hold is only so much. So if that's the case, then I should look at the universe and look at myself and say it's a mystery that I'm never going to understand. I should try still.
Yeah.
And I do try to attempt to understand it and attempt to redefine it, but I often don't have the answer. So I want to address one more thing before we close out the chat, and I think it's an important thing. Oftentimes, even from people who really like us, who really like the space, who come here a lot, people will ask me, what are your beliefs? And I talk about some of these general ideas, and I talk about spiritual actualization as defined by whoever is here at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes when people will say, well, what's the rest of the story? What do you really believe? Because these are very vague beliefs, and everything we've been talking about is, I think it's actually quite defined. But I think other people say, well, that's a really vague. And when you try and write this stuff down, it remains vague and sort of nebulous to people. So a lot of times people ask me the question, what's the rest of the story? And they assume that there's some deeper set of secrets that we have in some tome in a back room that we don't let anyone into. And that's actually not true. But I do think that some of the vagueness has given rise to a lot of concerns that people have. Oregon is a state that has a history of having
cults.
a lot of cults. Yeah, exactly. And so even people who are very sympathetic of what we're doing, who are very much in agreement and in alignment with a lot of the things we're doing,
Mm-hmm.
ask me questions as though I'm going to say, yeah, this is, once you're here for 3 months, you got to give us your credit card, and we'll never get to that point. But it's a very reasonable concern, and it's a very reasonable question.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been thinking a lot about how do we not only prove that we're not a cult, but more importantly, safeguard against becoming a cult or going down that road at all.
Mm-hmm.
How do we have just the most scrupulous safeguards that we can have so that we don't become a cult and don't become that really dark side of religion? Religion institutionally already has a lot of really dark sides, genocide, ethnocide, but cults are really terrible, and there's something else. So how do we safeguard from being a cult?
I'm not exactly sure how we safeguard from being a cult, from becoming a cult. One thing that I see that has been very reassuring for me is transparency. I love it when you say things like, I don't really know what I'm doing. Because the truth is, who does? And so you're being very honest about the process. And to me, like that, you are, there's a really high level of integrity because you're, walking the walk, walking the talk. You're being honest. You're saying this is a place where we can come together and explore things and be honest. And that reminds me of your value of science. Science is something that is very much about like calling it like it is, being accurate, la la la, and not trying to say that it knows more than it does. I'm saying science is bad at that, but
I would agree with that statement.
Yeah.
I think science is really bad about overstepping its own degree of confidence in its own knowledge base.
Yeah.
But it's hard to say that because oftentimes when I say that, people say, oh, well, you're religious, so you're going to bring in God. And that's not the reason. It's because I think sometimes science is too sparse and sometimes it's not sparse enough. But keep going.
Yeah. There's faith, like no matter, we are spiritual beings. And of course, this is kind of like my spiritual beliefs coming out. But I believe that we are spiritual beings partly because of what you said, which is we are fractionated. We have limited perspective. We have imprecise tools. We have language. And this is, I made a joke about the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. But I really believe that that is a fundamental dilemma that we experience. And in philosophy, there are all of these schools of thought around the importance of language and how it shapes our reality. And ultimately, it is a representation of experience. But my point is that we are limited. We have limited perspective. Even when we do come together and dialogue, there's never, the universe is so dynamic and time itself, is endless. Anyway, it has to be vague. They have to be vague. Because once, like you said, once you become not vague, or once you think you know the truth, you stop knowing it. And it's a paradox. It's hard to understand. And then that's where faith comes in, because faith means that I can believe conflicting things at the same time. You know, I can function as though whatever, I don't have a good example, can function as though there is a God, whatever that means. I can function as though there is some like higher power, even though, and at the same time, I can function, or I can acknowledge that really I don't know anything. So, you know, we are very imaginative creatures. We fill in the gaps. We like to fill in the gaps. We like to have the gaps filled in, but it's very hard, and you're doing a very good job, I think, of resisting the urge to get super rigid. But how do we prevent from becoming a cult? What is a cult?
I don't know the answer, but I think I have at least, I've been thinking about this for a while now. And I think I have one partial answer that I think will help us, which is that I think of cults as the cults that I've known are very resistant to any departure. So if you can depart a cult and they're fine with it, that's usually not like, you know, you should be able to walk out the door at any time. And a lot of cults, you really can't do that, right? So like, to give you like an example, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I think Scientology, if you leave Scientology and then you speak out against Scientology, they have this kind of golden rule where if you speak out against Scientology, they can speak out against you, right? So I think that really discourages people from leaving. So my idea is we should make it as easy as possible for people to walk out the door. And I think that's a nice thing, and that's not a bad thing, and I think that would help us to not be a cult. And, oh, no, go ahead.
And we should encourage them to badmouth us. And then we won't badmouth them, so they know.
And then give people material to badmouth us with.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then they know they can badmouth us, and we won't even badmouth them back.
Excellent suggestion.
Okay.
But, you know, a lot of people, we were having this conversation on Friday night when we had a show here, and people were like, you should have a membership. You should have a list of members, and then people pay in.
Oh.
And one of the reasons why I don't want to do that is because we could do that and still not be a cult, and a lot of religions do that, and they're not cults. But I think it's more scrupulous to not do that at all, to avoid any chance of becoming more cult-like. So I think, so that's why I was saying, I don't really want to have membership. You know, I want people to be like,
super free.
It's super free, and I don't know your
free to come and go.
I don't know your legal name necessarily. I don't need to. Well, I do, but but I think but no, I do think that we could have a membership, and we could have people like make donations. But I would really just rather have people donate when they want to and when they come here, and not have to have a membership. And maybe that won't keep us from becoming a cult, but it's at least one safeguard that I think that way we don't have any records. No one's like coming and hunting you down for your donation. There's no chance that anyone could ever like.
Nice.
I think it's one potential safeguard. So one safeguard is we should let people walk out the door whenever they want, and they can always leave, and that's fine. Another safeguard is,
in fact, we'll kick them out sometimes. Just everyone get out.
I told you no silliness.
Oh yeah.
And you violated that rule. So now I'm kicking you out. Okay. To prove the point.
I'll go bad now.
Yeah. But we should wrap it up. And I do want to say I think that's one reason why I don't want to do that, is to be extra scrupulous, to be extra cautious, that we don't have any chance of becoming more cult-like by having our members, you know, onerously buy into what we're doing.
What if we say we are a cult? Do cults ever say that they're a cult?
No, they don't. So if we said, yes, we are a cult,
that means
that would automatically mean we're not. Because you know why? The Tao is known, is the Tao that is not known. Yeah. Okay. So I think we have a solution. So A, start advertising that we're a cult. Yeah. B, start letting people badmouth us and giving them material to badmouth us.
Encouraging them to badmouth us.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the evidence is encouragement, right? So, like, we'll have like a stack of like, you know. All right, I'm going to cut the conversation short here because I think we covered a lot of the crowd, and also I don't know what I was falling for that too. But that was a really productive conversation. I think it was super enlightening, and I hope some of you out there will tune into this video and get some more information about what Alluvium is, and just get a little more perspective on who we are and who we strive to be and who we hope you strive to be. And always, I'll close with the thought that we're here every Sunday at 7. We don't put any pressure on anyone, but you're invited to join us, and I think, speaking for Red and myself at least, we would definitely like that.
Come on down. You can leave whenever you want.
All right, and thanks very much to Red Wilson for joining me and for being open to having this discussion. I kind of sprung this on her, but I think that was a really productive discussion, and I think we covered a lot of ground. So thanks everyone for tuning in.
Bye.